Hey, hi all. Randy Roth here, coming at you from Paraguay. Today we're going to talk about the two messages of salvation and their contrast, the message that the dispensationalists teach and the message that Christ taught. Now, dispensationalists understand that they teach a totally different message of salvation than what Christ taught, and that's because they tell us that the dispensation of Christ is not valid for the church. What is a dispensation? It's not an era of time. A dispensation is a message, gospel, teaching that God has given to an individual to dispense to others, as Paul demonstrates with in Ephesians 3:2, when he says that the dispensation of grace has been given to me for you word in the King James. He's been given, the dispensation of grace has been given me to dispense to you. That's all Paul is saying. See, Jesus brought us grace. John 1:16 and 18 declares that. And he taught us grace. And it's found in Matthew 19 and Luke 18. So Jude then tells us that wicked men have crept in and changed the salvation and grace of our God to lewdness or lasciviousness, and tells us to earnestly contend for what was first taught. So if we are to earnestly contend, we must first understand what was first taught, and we must understand how wicked men, Jude says, evil men have crept in unawares. Okay, so if we do not understand that, then we most often are connected to what the evil men have crept in and changed it to. So we need to look at these contrasts. So often I get asked, what must I do to be saved on my website? And it's like, whenever somebody asks that, they're not interested in getting saved. What they're interested is in arguing that their method of salvation is one different, and that my method, they say, is not right. Why is that? Well, because I teach the same message that Christ taught, because you must believe Jesus to be saved. And they teach a totally different message. And so today we're going to look at the contrast of that message. So the dispensationalists, they must separate themselves from the teaching of Christ, because they say that only the dispensation of Paul is what's valid for the church today. Well, first let's address that. Paul says, follow me as I follow Christ. It's found in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 1. And Paul also says in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 8, that Christ will destroy those who do not adhere to the gospel of Jesus Christ when he comes, when we are gathered unto him, as chapter 2, verse 1 tells. So here we have, within 5 verses, that Jesus is declared that he's coming and that he's destroying those who do not adhere to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And the dispensationalists know that they do not adhere to the gospel of Jesus Christ. In fact, when we get to Revelation 14, verse 6, the angel in heaven declares that the everlasting gospel is taught to the tribulation saints. So, well, not necessarily it doesn't mention the tribulation saints per se. It just says that that's what's being taught. And, everybody understands that that is to whom it's being directed. So what we got going on here is we have the everlasting gospel. That's what Jesus taught, which Jesus, made possible through the death on the cross, his death, burial, and resurrection. Now, Paul states that he taught the gospel of Jesus Christ in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 1 through 4. In verse 1 and 2, he tells us, he writes that he had previously taught them and that they, know it, and that's what they're believing. And then he says in verse 2 and 3 that he showed them in the Old Testament where it was prophesied his death, burial, and resurrection. And then in verse 5 through 7, he notes that all these people that have seen Christ afterwards. So in these passages, Paul is not teaching the gospel whatsoever. He's referencing what he had taught, and then he showed them in the Old Testament where the events that occurred were prophesied, and then he notes that people saw them afterwards. So at no point is Paul teaching the gospel. However, dispensationalists point to this passage, just verses 1 through 4, they say. They don't mention verse 5, which is a continuation of what's being said. Instead, they just mention 1 through 4 and say, this is the gospel, because they have to separate the gospel of Paul from the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so, what is it that they hate about the gospel of Jesus Christ? And I say hate because they truly hate the gospel that Jesus Christ taught. It's found it's found throughout the Gospels. Christ always taught total surrender as a method of salvation. Got an alarm going off. What is that for? Anyways, so what we got going on, I better go check it out. What we got going on is we have the gospel that says, hey, look, we've got to surrender all. And they don't like that idea. Surrendering all is a serious issue. Instead, they like to say, well, you just need to believe Jesus, believe the events that he did, that he rose from the dead, he died and rose again. That's all you got to do, is believe the events that he did and not the words that come out of his mouth. See, because the words that come out of his mouth are what cause people to dislike the gospel. That's why the 70 followed him no more. They didn't like what came out of his mouth. It's recorded in John 6:66 over the concept of communion. And so, what does the gospel that we want to talk about here that really puts the nail into the coffin for the dispensationalists is the message that Christ gave to the rich young ruler, found in Matthew 19 and Luke 18. So let's look at Luke 18. The rich young ruler comes to Christ and says, what must I do to be saved? And Jesus mentions some of the 10 commandments. Matthew records a different set than what Luke records, so it could be that he mentioned every single one of them. I don't know. And so the rich young ruler says, I have kept these things from my youth. Jesus said, there's one thing that you lack. Go, sell everything that you have, give it to the poor, and come follow me. Jesus was noting what was God over this guy's life. We must surrender all. If there's anything in our life that we're in control over that we don't like, that rules over Christ. And we are still Lord over our life, over that area. And this concept is what grates on people, whether or not it's the rich young ruler or the 70 that followed him no more. This particular issue of surrendering all is where it boils down to whether or not we follow Christ. To be called a Christian is to be noted as a follower of Christ. If we're not following Christ and we're following our own selfish ambitions, we're not a Christian. We're a self-centered individual following our own way. All we like sheep have gone astray, following our own way. So how do we get back to, being a Christian? We must surrender all. So the disciples, so after this event, the rich young ruler went away sorrowful, which indicates that he believed Jesus and he received what Jesus said. He simply could not do what Jesus told him to do. So the disciples then asked, well, who then can be saved? And Jesus responded, with man it is impossible, but with God all things are possible. And this is the message of grace. See, for by grace are we saved through faith. If the rich young ruler had said, look, I want to, I can't bring myself to do it, help. God gives grace to the humble. He resists the proud. If the rich young ruler had asked for help and said, hey, look, I need help, he would have exemplified the humility in which grace could have been applied. So often in my life, I find that, it's like, I need help. I need help to be able to surrender all. There's things that come up, thieves that come in, liars that come out, and it grates on me, and I need to surrender that part to my life. And it's like, I can't do it on my own. And what does the scripture says? We need to boldly come to the throne of grace today so that we can obtain grace for that time of need. I know that there's going to be that time when it's like myself wants to rise up and say, I'm a Lord over my life in this area. And that's why I need to pray today to boldly come before the throne of grace and obtain that grace, because I know that day is coming. And, because this is historically, that's where it's at. So I need to boldly go before the throne of grace and obtain it so that when that day comes, I have it, so that God can rule and reign in my life and not me. Okay, so this is the message of grace, that with man it is impossible, but with God all things are possible. That is what grace is, God making the impossible possible. So what we got going on here is we got grace through faith. We are saved by grace through faith and not of works. But then James 2:20 tells us that faith without works is dead. Why is that? Well, because, see, God gives us the grace, and by faith, we are empowered to do it. We are empowered to believe. And then we look back and we see the works that we believed. See, believing is a work. Oh, no. Jesus declares that believing is a work. John 6:28 and 29. People came to him and said, what is the work we must do to be saved? And Jesus said, this is the work you must do. You must believe on him who sent me. The work is believing. If nobody had to do anything, then everybody would be saved. Thing is, you have to do something to get saved. Therefore, there has to be a work involved. And Jesus, who is God, declares that believing is a work. So if you ask the dispensationalists, well, what must I do to be saved? And they'll tell you, well, you got to believe that Jesus died, was buried, and rose again. According to 1 Corinthians 15, verse 1 through 4. Well, they're now teaching a salvation of works. You must believe in historical events to be saved. Nothing about surrendering your life to Jesus. Not, they'll quote other passages about believing in Jesus, but they won't tell you that you actually have to believe what he says. They reduce it to a form of believing in his existence. You know, I mean, Scripture says all those who call upon the name of the Lord will be saved. Well, the word there is sozo, and the word for sozo is what's used for saved, it's used for being healed, and it's used for being delivered. So the word there is all those who call upon the Lord will be delivered. That's what it's talking about. So saved, healed. All those who call upon the Lord will be healed. Are you calling upon the Lord to be healed? And you're not seeing healing? Well, there's a problem there in that thinking then, isn't it? Because if you think that you're calling upon the Lord for it and it's not happening, something's wrong with some missing element in that equation. All those who call upon the Lord will be saved. They will be delivered. The delivery may not look like what we're looking at or what we expect, but it happens. So often the issue of understanding comes from a discrepancy between one language and another language. For example, Jesus spoke Aramaic, but then the text that we get our Bible from is in Greek. And, the first 5 books of the Bible were written in Aramaic, and there's arguments on whether or not Matthew was actually first written in Aramaic or in Greek. I believe it was first written in Aramaic. But, I mean, the first 5 books of the Bible in Aramaic are called the Peshitta. And you can look that up online, peshitta.org, and you can put in your verse, and you can get it now once removed from the original language to English rather than having a middleman of Greek. So, we get translations going from Aramaic to Greek, and there's some discrepancies there. There's, things mean differently from one language to another. And then when you move from Greek to English, now again, you have a second, it's twice removed from the original. One of those words where doctrines are created is the term generation in Matthew 24, verse 34. Jesus didn't say this generation will not pass away. He said that this people, the context is the fig tree, the verse before. He's saying this people, this people of Israel will not pass away until all these things are fulfilled. And now we have all these crazy doctrines out there. The preterists base their doctrine on this single verse. We have the futurist that has to insist that, Jesus lied to the disciples about the second temple, and they conjure up a third temple because they have to force the generation into a futuristic generation. Okay, getting back to the message of salvation. The difference between the message of salvation that dispensationalism teaches and what Christ teaches is vast. The dispensationalists will tell you, no, you don't have to believe Jesus to be saved. Jesus is no longer the way, the truth, and the life, and we can make it through to the Father through this mere man, Paul. I mean, they won't say that to your face because they would know that they're not trying to convince you of anything, but that's what they mean when they say what they're saying, that we don't have to follow Christ. Do you really think that Christ came all this way to go die on the cross just for his message to be swept underneath the rug by the dispensationalists? No. Salvation comes through total surrender to Jesus. But salvation is a free gift. Salvation is a gift. Look at Romans 6:23. It is a gift of God. But look at verse 22, where Paul notes that its servitude is the price. The gift is not free. Indeed, salvation is a gift, but it's not a free gift. It costs you everything. All right. I think I've said what I came to say concerning the message of salvation. When somebody asks me on the website, what must I do to be saved? It's really sad because they're not interested on how to get saved. They're interested on their excuses on how to not follow Jesus. All right. Hope this is helpful. Take care, God bless, and surrender your life to Jesus.